Harold Henry died in Gatesville, Texas on January 19th, 2013. The 77-year-old man was found lying in the doorway of his apartment, 10 minutes from the Patrick L. O'Daniel prison, where Texas houses many of its female prisoners. And there's a reason for him living in that location, which we will get to very soon. The death of Harold Henry did not make headlines in the Gatesville Messenger and Star Forum. At first, no one noticed at all, but that sure could have been because of a double murder on the front page that happened 35 miles west over in Bell County. The couple's son killed them, but I have not dived in to find out any more information about it. I know that their last name is Youngblood. Anyhow, back to Harold. I do think that that had something to do with it, though, why Harold didn't get more attention right then. Later, when Harold's children, Deborah Berner and Dallas Henry, pushed for an investigation, Harold's death finally garnered a bit of attention. An investigative reporter named Glenna Whitney became interested after helping another victim of today's Black Widow that we're talking about, or kind of a Black Widow, to be caught and put behind bars. Miss Whitney's article was The Killer Instinct. It appeared in the D magazine. It was this excellent article that encouraged my investigation into this case and made me want to share it with you. I will link it on my blog or in the comments so you can read Miss Whitney's article. Law enforcement finally admitted that the circumstances were unusual about the way that Harold died. Even so, no one has been prosecuted to this day. Based on what this story holds, I don't think his death was natural. That's just my personal opinion. Let me know in the comments later if you agree. Hi friends, it's Brenda at Vintage Texas Crimes, and I'm so glad you're here. I really appreciate your support, the likes, the follows, the blog reads at my website, and the subs on YouTube. Subs means subscriptions. I wondered if they were serving sub sandwiches when I first heard somebody use that, but now my ear is very attuned to it. So anyway, thank you for subscribing to my little channel on YouTube. Comments, and we'll talk about my experience and my path that led me here another day. Right now, it's time to get back to Harold's story. Before his years in Gatesville, Harold Henry was born in Roby, Texas in 1936, but his family moved to South Dakota when he was 12 years old. They went back to Texas to live for one more year when Harold was a senior in high school, so he graduated from Roby High School in, I believe it was 1944. His family went back to South Dakota, and that's where Harold was living when, or before, he started writing letters and making phone calls to a Texas prisoner. He lived a quiet life, self-contained in South Dakota, near a town called Seneca in Falk County, South Dakota. He was a rancher, and that's the work that he retired from. By the time Harold enters our story, he was able to save $500,000 to supplement his retirement income. Now, I'm mentioning that because it's a critical point of the story. He lived carefully and frugally, probably too frugally. If you're a parent, sometimes being too frugal can be difficult for your children. His family members described him as thrifty to the point of rigidity, someone who spent little and expected everyone else to do the same. That approach had governed his household when his children were growing up. He provided food, clothing, and a roof, but little else for them. And his children grew up accustomed to having only necessities. After he and his second wife divorced, see, he wasn't good at keeping wives because they couldn't live like that. And you know, it's understandable that, you know, someone enjoys being extremely thrifty and just seeing how little they can do, how little money they can spend and live, get by. But it's not something that everybody enjoys. So it finally caused Harold to be a lonely man. He stayed close to the ranch, and his son, Dallas Henry, took over it, and he helped Dallas with the chores. He got to know his grandchildren, and his daughter-in-law said he was helpful and likable, and she enjoyed getting to know him at that point in their lives. This was a change from when his children were little. He was stingy with his time when his children were growing up also. Dallas Henry, Harold's son, said that he was a better grandparent than a father. And that's, maybe that's the way we all are. As we get older, we realize what's really important. Harold was sensitive to gray days and long winters, what we now call seasonal affective disorder, appropriately called SAD for seasonal affective disorder. He spent a few months once in a mental health facility with depression because of the long cold spells. After that, he adjusted and he started driving down to Texas, where he had lived when he was young, for the winter months, and that really helped him. In 1997, Harold Henry found a website called WriteAPrisoner.com. It's still there. And he began corresponding with an incarcerated woman in Gatesville, Texas. Over time, the correspondence expanded to phone calls. The woman was 48-year-old D. Ellen Bellah, and her last name Bellah, and D and Ellen are two words, who, by the way, lied on her Write a Prison profile and said she was in her 50s because she was looking for a certain type of man, and she was actually in her 40s, and she wanted an older man who would feel comfortable with her age, and that older man must have a nest egg, and she found her perfect match in 63-year-old Harold Henry. D. Ellen had been sentenced to 50 years in prison for conspiracy to murder her friend Sandra Harper Dial. The murder happened in Hunt County, a rural area in Dallas, Texas, in 1991, and I plan to cover that story in detail soon, but it'll make a great prequel for Harold's story. But for today, we're just sticking with Harold's part of the tragedies that D. Ellen caused. Authorities said that in 1996, Harold's new friend, D. Ellen, had helped her boyfriend, D. Ellen had helped her boyfriend at the time, Don Dial was his name, like Dial soap or dial a telephone back in the day, and the victim's ex-brother-in-law. So Sandy Harper had been married to Lynn Dial, who was Don Dial's brother. Okay, D. Ellen helped her boyfriend murder Sandy Harper Dial after taking out a $100,000 policy on Sandy's life payable to D. Ellen. Now that's the crime, and I'm going to stop right there because there's a lot more to it. It's very interesting, but we're going to stick with Harold. When D. Ellen began corresponding with Harold Henry, she told him she would have never done such a terrible crime. It's all a big mistake. I was framed, she said. And by the way, D. Ellen almost got by with Sandy Harper's murder, but Sandy had a pushy sister named Janet Holly, God bless her, who would not give up. And she was joined by investigative reporter Glenna Whitley, writing about the case several times in D magazine. Kind of a hero. Sandy Harper Dial's murder would have gone unsolved if not for those two. But back to Harold again. Harold Henry. He believed everything D. Ellen told him, and he was smitten. As the relationship continued, Harold began making plans to relocate to Gatesville, Texas, where D. Ellen was incarcerated. His plan when he got there was to hire the best appellate attorney money could buy, and he would get D. Ellen out of prison so they could live their best lives together, as if D. Ellen ever planned to live with Harold Henry. D. Ellen reeled poor old Harold Henry right in, and in 1998, the retired rancher loaded up some 80-plus Pearl Snap Western shirts, because he had a lot of them, and moved them all to Gatesville, along with a pair of pants or two and some items that he would need for living there. That's where Ellen Bellah was incarcerated. At that point, they had become engaged. Now, after the move, money started bleeding out of Harold's accounts. Immediately, he began putting $200 per month in Ellen's prison commissary account and established a bank account that he deposited money into every day for her use. Where, and I'm thinking, why would you do that for someone who's in prison, but I guess that he really cared about her, and if something happened to him, he wanted her to have an account with some money in it. Soon, Harold wrote a new will, leaving everything to D. Ellen Bellah rather than his children, Deborah Berner and Dallas Henry. A copy of the will went into D. Ellen's prison file to document the change. Harold shelled out $50,000 for Walter Reeves, Jr., a Waco attorney who was famous across the state for appellate work. He wanted him to pursue an appeal vigorously on D. Ellen's behalf, and that was denied 2 years later in 2000, the year 2000. Later, he paid $10,000 to hire Paige Massey, an Austin attorney, to help her with a parole hearing, because at that point she was getting close to being, she had spent 6 years in, let's see, 6 years maybe in prison, and that they were looking at, I really don't know what her first year for parole hearings were, but I think it does. I think that at the end of this, I have it written down. Anyway, in 2009, Harold paid $25,000. Now, this was later in 2009. Harold paid $25,000 to D. Ellen's niece, supposedly as half of the retainer for Michael Ware, an attorney in Austin whom D. Ellen said would represent her as part of his Innocence Project work. But I don't even think that was a real thing. In addition, Harold provided financial support to Bella's daughter, Michelle, and he called her Shell Gober, as she worked towards establishing a midwife business. And then, after Shell whined about a car, now get this, Harold Henry traveled by bus to South Dakota, specifically to retrieve his 14-year-old sedan from his son, Dallas Henry, who had been using the vehicle with Harold's permission and blessing to transport his grandchildren, Dallas Henry's grandchildren, to and from daycare. Because, sometimes grandfathers get wedged into those little jobs, and grandmothers and whatever. And so I'm guessing they had a truck and as their family vehicle, or maybe two of them. And, you kind of need that back seat when you've got children under 4, especially, or maybe a little older now, I don't know. But anyway, Dallas was using that vehicle that was just sitting there on the ranch to take his children back and forth to daycare. Well, Harold said, I'm coming after the car. He drove to Texas. He picked it up. He drove in from Texas. He picked it up, drove it back to Texas, and gave it to Shell Gober, telling Dallas, his son, pretty little Shell needed it more. She was really struggling. Well, the car was sold almost as soon as he got it back to Gatesville, and the money given to D. Ellen. It's worth commenting here that Harold had never provided financial assistance to his own children at any point in their lives. On the other hand, he was spending lavishly on D. Ellen Bellah and Shell Gober. And as I studied this, I never got a sense of bitterness out of his children. That was his money. He could spend it like he wanted to, and they did not question him, because they knew that their father had always been very frugal and did not expect that he would spend a dime more than he had to. In fact, when he got to Gatesville, even though he had money in a bank account, he insisted that he be able to move into one of the subsidized housing units, a lower income apartment, so that he only paid a very little small bit of rent based on his Social Security payment income, which he lived off of, and frugal, but very frugal. And yet he had $500,000 in a bank account. But that, people said he would drive $30. He would drive 30 miles for a free meal. He was just, his frugal is probably a nice word. We could probably change that to being a terrible tightwad. So anyway, but Miss Whitley, Glenna Whitley, the writer that introduced me to all this information, did not say that about him. Those are my words, because I just put 2 and 2 together. I figure, I'm saying that's what he is. He was a tightwad and stingy. Stingy, I think that was a word, better than frugal. Anyhow, that's what is so important to understand about his personality, because short of Okay, after the car incident, then Dallas Henry was watching television one evening and saw a true crime show with a woman in it who'd been convicted of killing someone for insurance money. The woman's picture was flashed. It was a Dallas, let's see, Eric Brockovich had that series out in 2003. And sometime between there and 2009, I think, it was when Dallas Henry saw it. And he called his sister, and she watched it also, and they were very disturbed about what they saw because the woman who was doing this, who had killed Sandy Harper Dial for her insurance money, was none other than the Ellen Bellah, and they saw it on television. Well, by late 2012 and early 2013, Harold's health and judgment began to deteriorate fast. He was beginning to recognize that D. Ellen might be lying to him about some of the things she said. For instance, she told him there was new DNA evidence that would free her, and that was a lie. There was never any DNA used or collected in that case that could have freed her. Harold was unable at that point to continue funding her with large deposits to her bank account because he was out of money. He disclosed to his children that he was being extorted by a scammer but he didn't know it was a scammer. This person said he would be shot if he didn't send money to him. Harold had used Western Union to wire 200,000, right at $203,000 to 5 different scammers in Jamaica. He had sent more money to Florida, Colorado, and Hawaii. And when he said, I don't have the money, the death threats began. And when Harold's own mother, who was probably, let's see, Harold was in his late 60s, maybe early 70s. And so his mother was probably getting on around 90 years old. When she became ill, she was still back with her grandchildren, Dallas Henry and Deb Berner. And when she got, it was that time and she was ill, and he made up unusual excuses why he wasn't going to come see his mother before she died. Then in early 2012, he did it again after she passed away. So Harold was too afraid to leave and go to the funeral. He really thought somebody was nearby with a rifle trained on him. And so that was kind of pathetic. So he wasn't able to give D. Ellen what she wanted, and then getting all this other pressure from these scammers. He's sitting there in his little bitty apartment and paranoid. Well, after Dallas Henry finally got that much out of Harold, his dad, the elder Henry signed a power of attorney over to Dallas and Deborah, which gave them the ability to look into Harold's finances. So Deborah began digging, and things started happening fast. She was shocked to find out that her dad had almost no money left in his bank account. He was practically destitute. Deborah Berner had small children and lived in South Dakota. Dallas Henry was saddled with the ranch. Neither of them could just leave and go to Texas at the drop of a hat, and Harold wasn't eager to come back to South Dakota just yet. So he was still hoping D. Ellen would get out of prison and live with him. About all Deborah could do was contact a social worker to look in on him. With no money coming in from Harold, Bella told him not to visit again. And by Bella, I should have just said D. Ellen Bellah, said don't bother to visit again. However, he sent her one more letter with $50 in it so she would talk to him because they had a very transactional relationship. Harold wrote at the top of one of the last letters he sent to D. Ellen, trust, trust, trust. And now this was in December 2012. And remember, he died in January in 2013. Okay, he asked her, why are you broke at the end of the month and Shell does not have the money to visit you? Here is $50 to write and explain yourself. You can trust me, but how can I trust you, all the money I've spent on you? Well, that was the end of the letter, but the social worker that Deb had called visited Harold. Afterward, she called Deb and told her that Harold had given her a lot of information. For one thing, he had told the social worker that Ellen Bellah was pressuring Harold to obtain a life insurance policy payable to her in case something happened to him. If he did that, she would get back with him. In other words, resume their engagement. He had also told the social worker that as part of the application process, Harold had been required to undergo a physical examination, and he was waiting for the results. In the meantime, Deborah called the police in the prison to tell them that Ellen Bellah had already convinced her father to pay out around $300,000 to her and her daughter for their expenses outside of prison and putting her money in her commissary, and had tried to get him to take out an insurance policy. Since this is the reason for her incarceration, we are very concerned she is setting him up and he will have some sort of accident if he gets this life insurance policy. The police detective suggested she contact the prison. It just kind of got into a round and round and round, and asked to be put in touch with an internal affairs investigator. So she calls the prison back, and the prison officials instructed Ellen Bellah to leave Harold Henry alone. And that's when, that's when Ellen learned that Deb, Harold's daughter, had Harold's power of attorney. She sent Harold a letter on January 10th, 2013. In this letter, Ellen indicated she believes his $164,000 annuity was still intact. Now, let me explain that. Harold, when he got to Texas, Gatesville, one of his investments had been an annuity. And once he was there, or maybe right before he left South Dakota, he had made it payable on death to her, to Ellen. And that way, if he died, she would get the $164,000 annuity that was still intact. Harold had previously told her it was payable to her on death. Ellen wrote to him, I kind of just repeated myself, but please forgive me, it's late. I hope that you are not destitute like Deb says. I thought you still had the large annuity, plus now your royalties coming in from the oil. I need to be informed about what you are doing. I'm having a very hard time without your help in my life. In other words, figure out a way to send me more money. She goes on, there is no limit of money you can deposit in my bank account. If you do make a deposit though, will you please do it in cash? I really don't need any more problems. Ellen Bellah to Harold Henry on January 10th, 2013. During the insurance policy application process, a physician was required to do a physical on him, and that was really a blessing in disguise because the physician determined that Harold was suffering from early dementia, and they certified him incompetent with respect to managing his finances. Imagine that. That happened on January 15th, 2013. And the daughter was contacted. Deborah was made aware that they had determined he was not able to manage his finances. So because of that, the life insurance policy would not be issued since Harold had a disease, dementia, that was eventually going to kill him. And so they didn't, and could even make the decision to purchase the policy. So Deborah tried to call her father all that day and then all day on the 16th, and she didn't get a hold of him. Finally, he called her back on January 17th. He told his daughter that all would be fine in just about a week. He would be back in South Dakota. So at that point, he had made a decision that he was done with Ellen Bellah. Okay, now I've already mentioned it's important to recall that Ellen still believed Harold had the annuity worth $164,000 payable to her upon death. And she had him put a memo in her prison file to that effect. So by the time Deb and Dallas were involved with Frank's finances, it was a sure thing that there was no money there for the annuity. Harold learned that Ellen had resumed listing herself on prison pal sites. He learned she lied to him about how the DNA would soon set her free. He found out she had managed to get a balance due from an attorney payable to Harold for the amount of $7,500 and had managed to get it deposited into her bank account. And apparently Harold didn't have the ability to take money out of her bank account. He's just set it up to make deposits into it. So this was for Paige Massey, the attorney he had hired to help her with her parole hearing. And unfortunately, Paige Massey had died by suicide without performing the work. So he had just gotten started on it, spent, he drew down $2,500 of that $10,000 retainer. And when he died, then whoever administered his estate sent the money to Ellen's personal bank account. And there was nothing Harold could do about it. Apparently, he had signed something that had been sent to Ellen, and she got him to sign it on a visit, but he's already got dementia, so, he didn't really understand what he was doing. But he knew that she had screwed him out of that money at the end. So he decided to leave Texas and return to South Dakota. Now, this man had come to Gatesville in his mid-60s. He had the money he needed. He didn't benefit from any of his savings. He gave $300,000 of it to Ellen and $200,000 of it to schemers and scammers off in Jamaica calling him. And now he was elderly and flat broke at age 76. On January 18th, Harold threw all of Ellen's letters into the trash and packed his car, putting all those pearl snap shirts back in. Going to take them back to South Dakota with him. He would leave the next day, Saturday, January 19th, but he was going to meet and have breakfast with his friend, Charles Hines, at McDonald's before getting on the road. Now, we've got another little story to talk about here, this little side crime story, little Texas crime story. Harold and Charles had become enamored with younger women who were serving time at Gatesville, both of them. Charles lived in Big Spring, and he drove often to visit his inmate girlfriend turned wife at the Patrick L. O'Daniel unit, where Ellen Bellah lived. I tried to find a picture of Carlene Easley Hines, but did not locate one. And I dug. Worked on her family tree so I could look at Ancestry for at least a high school annual picture, and I couldn't get into it. I couldn't find one because I think, this is sad, but I think that she probably was married like 5 times because, I'll tell you in just a minute. When he was in town, when Charles Hines was in town, he often spent the night at Harold's apartment. They had breakfast together whenever Charles had driven in from Big Spring, which was a 3 or 4 hour drive to Gatesville for that old guy. But he was in his 60s, and so he was still plenty able to do that. They had known each other, though, for 10 years, and I'm belaboring this point because you need to remember that. Charles Hines' wife, Carlene Easley Hines, had killed her 5th husband with several blasts from a single-shot shotgun. And using absolutely poor judgment all the way around, Charles said, well, let's get married, So, I don't know. He made his prison girlfriend the sole heir to his estate, which was probably a couple $100,000 then. I mean, he had a house and, a few dollars in the bank, but he left it all to her. Carlene Easley Hines, as you might expect, had a best friend in prison. And guess who that was? Well, none other than Ellen Bellah. Carlene had shot her husband, Jerry Wayne Easley, in 1996. And this is an important point, too, because he was supposedly pushing Benadryl capsules, little pink and white capsules, into her mouth and trying to kill her with them. She killed him. She roused out of her sleep. They'd been drinking. She roused out of her sleep. She managed to spit out some of it, but then she went and got a shotgun and she pumped him full of, I don't know the gauge, but I wanted to know that. I just couldn't find it. Pumped him full of shot. Anyway, and then she went to the hospital, told the first responders that he had been giving her this Benadryl while she was passed out. And sure enough, she did indeed have a toxic amount of Benadryl in her system. So keep all that in mind. On the morning that Harold Henry was supposed to leave, which was the 19th, January 19th, he and Harold were going to meet first thing for breakfast. Uh, and I also find it, and he had been spending the night with his friend. Charles had been spending the night with Harold. If Charles was in town, I don't understand why he hadn't spent the night with Harold the night before, but it doesn't appear that he did. Charles and Harold were meeting at McDonald's, which was 2 blocks from Harold's apartment. So Charles was waiting there for Harold, and he did not show up. He decided, I'll just stroll down to Harold's apartment and see what's holding him up. So when he got to Harold's apartment, Harold was collapsed on the threshold of his front door, fully dressed. Now, let me back up and point out that this is 2013, and at that time, Charles Hines was 71. And unless he's an exceptional 71-year-old, he is not jogging 2 blocks down to Harold's apartment. But he may have been. I don't know. But anyway, he found his friend collapsed on the threshold of his front door, fully dressed. And rather than knocking on doors and asking someone to call 911, Charles Hines walked 2 blocks back to McDonald's to enlist help from some soldiers he had seen eating breakfast in McDonald's. Now, the reason he didn't use Harold's phone is because Harold had 2 cell phones, and neither one of them were in the apartment that morning. A Gatesville officer arrived at that apartment at 6:18 a.m., followed by paramedics. By then, Harold was dead. And as to the 6:18 a.m., that seemed really early, but I checked the time when McDonald's might be open. I'm not going down there at 6:18 a.m., but it seems that McDonald's generally open at between 5 and 6 a.m. So that's early. It wasn't that early. Now, get this. A note beside Harold read, "Think I am having a heart attack. Cremate me." Close quote. The note was written in black marker. And guess what? There was no marker found in Harold's apartment or in his trash. Also, like I said earlier, Harold's two phones with 2 phone lines were missing. And I think that's funny he had 2 phone lines because he was so frugal, but he did. And neither, I guess what he had done is when he sold the ranch, he probably had those 2 lines and he thought, well, I don't want to lose my phone number that I've had forever, so I'm going to just put it on another cell phone. I don't know. That's just a guess. But those 2 phones had been stolen. And I'm just wondering, could it be that someone didn't want Harold to make any phone calls to 911 that morning? Dressed, and he just passed out there in that door. As soon as he could, Charles Hines left the scene, and he lit a shut, went over to that red brick prison and the Patrick O. Daniel unit, and he visited Carlene, and then he went and visited Ellen and told her of Harold's death. So, Deborah and Dallas found out that morning, and as soon as they found out, Dallas called Harold's landlord and asked him to go over or the office manager of that low-income housing project, and told him to please be kind enough to go get Harold's trash and lock it up, and he would get it in the next day or so because he was going to get there as soon as he could. Um, they, often when someone after 70 just seems to have had a heart attack or something like that, there's not an autopsy. But Dallas and Deborah both pushed for an autopsy to make sure that he got one. I don't know really what the rules are, but I know that if it's kind of looks expected, a lot of times there won't be an autopsy unless someone pushes for it. That then they pushed also to have a screening for drugs. And would you believe the autopsy revealed 355 milligrams of diphenhydramine, which is the Benadryl medication. It's in the medication that we call Benadryl, in Harold's system, which is like taking 14 Benadryl tablets. He also took something for his heart or his blood pressure. I can't remember for sure. And then there was so he had taken that, and the doctor with the autopsy said it was an accidental overdose of diphenhydramine, and it might have had a bad reaction with his heart or blood pressure medicine because he just took the one medicine. He did have allergies, but he didn't like to take Benadryl for it, and he had just told his daughter-in-law that he didn't care for Benadryl. He had also had a neck injury that was found on the autopsy, and I don't know much. That's all that my material said. And let's see, I think it's 25 years you've got to wait. So it'd be 2 more years before I can look up and see if any of that information was on his death certificate. 25 years, and Texas releases death certificates. Um, okay, now we're getting close to the end. Thank you for sticking with me this long. So when Charles was questioned about Harold, Charles, his good friend who spends the night with him and who he's going to get up and go have breakfast with that morning, when Charles was questioned about Harold, he said he had only met him a few months earlier and didn't really know him that well. Dallas's wife, Lori, told investigators that Harold had just told her the week before, that's the daughter-in-law, that he did not take Benadryl because he didn't like the side effects. So there's that. And just like there was no Sharpie, black Sharpie or a Marks-a-Lot, I don't even know if they still make Marks-a-Lots anymore, but that's what markers were when I was growing up and in school. Just like there was no Sharpie or a Marks-a-Lot in that apartment that could have written that note. Nothing. I mean, police searched for it and Dallas searched for it. It just wasn't there. And guess what? There was no packaging from Benadryl or anything else that would have had diphenhydramine products, and he could have taken them. There was none of that in his apartment. So where did that black marker go? And where did the diphenhydramine pills come from? It's just crazy. The cremate me note was never checked for fingerprints. And as mentioned earlier, Harold's 2 cell phones with 2 lines were missing from the apartment, and someone actually called his voicemail after he was dead. But investigators did not follow up on it or see who had made that phone call. Who or where that phone call originated. Like, if it was made in my house, they probably could have seen that, hey, somebody in this house made that phone call, but they didn't follow up on it. Let's see, D. Ellen's daughter, Shell, was in town for 2 days the previous week and for 2 days the day before and the day after Harold was found dead. She knew about his death when she left Gatesville and went to stay with her father. She went to spend the night with him, but she never said a word to her father about the death. And she saw him the same day. And she never said, hey, this man who has really been nice to me and my mother there in the prison died. And her father knew nothing about Charles' death until investigators came to his home and wanted to talk to Shell. In the meantime, D. Ellen gave Shell her power of attorney, D. Ellen's power of attorney. Shell tried to collect on Harold's estate on D. Ellen's behalf, but I don't think there was anything in there, and I'll get to that in just a minute. Given the neck injury and the diphenhydramine overdose, you'd think this would cause a little more investigation, but not so. A year went by before investigators even interviewed D. Ellen. She convinced investigators that Harold never gave her any substantial amount of money. $50,000, $10,000, $25,000. Anything. She never asked him for anything. D. Ellen also told investigators she thought he was a child molester, to be honest, because look, his kids didn't even want to visit him. That's just mind-blowing. The so-called ex-fiance of Harold Henry, who had sponged up $300,000 of his money, said she had never intended to have anything to do with him if she had been paroled. She had all his letters, his will, plus the note about the annuity in her prison file. And ultimately, investigators believed her because of all that documentation she had collected and had him go to the warden's office and put in her prison file. So the medical examiner ruled the death accidental. Texas Ranger Jason Bobo reviewed the case after Dallas and Deborah just wouldn't let it go. They kept insisting that something was wrong, that this wasn't right. investigation needed to happen. He also went and spoke to Ellen and cleared her of any wrongdoing. But remember, the investigators had never even interviewed Ellen for a year after Harold's death. So it was probably 2 years before Ranger Bobo got in there and talked to her. A week after he talked to Ellen, the inquiry was closed, and Ranger Bobo said it had just been an accidental death of an old man who had bankrupted himself through poor decisions. I personally think it is possible that a certain prison inmate found a friend or family member to do a little baking or drink mixing in which to hide diphenhydramine. But I just read about this story the other day. I certainly have no proof. Someone may have been thinking if Harold leaves town, he will go to his South Dakota bank and put that annuity back in his name or in that of his children. And, I can't let that happen. I can't let him leave town until this is taken care of. So how could that be done? And again, just speculating. How could it be done, though? I'm not sure what would hide the bitterness in that medication, what you could put it in that would hide it. But poisoning by diphenhydramine has been achieved in a murder. It was reported in a true crime show, maybe Dateline or 48 Hours, or even 2020, one of those three. I know for certain it was one of those three, where the villain, it was a wife, put it into a drink like Gatorade while they were out on a boat. The man, who was a loving husband, but he didn't like shady behavior, and his wife was being very shady with her job. She'd stolen money for her job, and she's about to get caught. And he would have divorced her. She knew it. So anyway, the man, she put it in his drink while they were out in a boat, and he ingested it, and the next thing you know, he fell in and drowned. I can see why they called Harold's situation, his incident, an accidental situation. It would be almost impossible to prove that someone came and helped him take a bunch of Benadryl or diphenhydramine tablets. Anyhow, we're at the end now, and I'm happy that Ellen basically got nothing at the end. The joke was on her. The scammers had cleaned out the annuity funds, and Harold was flat broke when he died. I might do a little more research on this and try to find out if Dallas Henry may have purchased, that may have been where the $500,000 came from. Dallas Henry may have paid his dad. I don't see his dad just handing him the ranch, or maybe he did, and that would be great if he did. But I don't think that the ranch was even still in Harold Henry's name. But the problem is, and so I wanted to look up his estate, and but there in Coryell County, I did one search on Harold Henry in the probate records, but I can only do like 1 or 2 searches a month without having to pay for it. It's not like that anyplace else. Now, you might have to pay to get copies of the documents, anyplace else I've ever looked, except South Dakota, because up in Fouke County, South Dakota, the fee was going to be $20 per record search online. And I'm just shaking my head that I would have to pay that much for public records. $20 is exorbitant. $5 would not be so bad. But anytime you get into something like that, you're going to have to conduct 2 or 3 searches before you get the name right. And that'll be lucky if you just have to do 3, because I do this a lot. I look. Anyhow, I hope this story was entertaining to you. I liked it enough to write a 10-page script on it and an article, which will be on my blog and on Facebook. And I can't thank you enough for taking the time to indulge me in telling stories. Please like and follow or subscribe for me on my Vintage Texas Crime web pages, social media. It really helps me to keep doing what I'm doing, because if nobody wants to hear it, I guess I'll just be sitting around here talking to myself all the time about it, about true crime in Texas. But if you have an opinion on what happened, I would love for you to put it in the comments and tell me what you think. Thank you. I'll see you in the next one.